Okay, let me introduce the last speaker. His name is Jakob Gertler, and he's from Southern Utah University from USA. And today he's present his paper, which is titled Identity, Silencing, and Non-Communicative Discursive Injustice. So good luck, Jakob.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm really glad and honored to be here. I've appreciated hearing the presentations of the speakers before me, and I'm excited to be able to share this idea with you. My name is Jakob Gertler. I'm an undergraduate student of philosophy at Southern Utah University in the United States, and I'm going to be presenting my paper, Identity Silencing and Non-Communicative Discursive Injustice. So before I get started, the argument that I'm making deals in an area of philosophy within philosophy of language called speech act theory. And there are a few key terms which I feel are important to define before I get into my argument. So the first, of course, is the speech act. And although there have been disagreements among philosophers about how to exactly define this term, a speech act is generally described as any utterance of meaningful words. So, for example, one might, while sitting at the dinner table, utter the words, "Please pass the salt." And this is a meaningful utterance in which the speaker is expecting something to happen in return for them uttering those words. So in this case, the speaker is likely asking their audience if they can pick up the salt and hand it to them. And this brings us to the second term, which I would like to define, which is uptake. And there have been several different accounts of uptake trying to explain what exactly it is. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm using Kuklas Definition of uptake, and I will be mentioning their arguments a little bit later on as well. And they define uptake as the audience's correct recognition of the speaker's intention when delivering a speech act. So in the case of "Please pass the salts," the speaker, as I mentioned before, is likely asking their audience to pick up the salt and hand it to them. And it's important to mention that according to Kuklas' account, the hearer does not necessarily need to complete the task which the speaker is asking them to complete, but merely to understand that they are being asked to hand the speaker the salts. In this case, the hearer may say, "No, I can't pass you the salts," or even ignore the speaker altogether. However, they would still be receiving uptake so long as they correctly recognize the speaker's intention. Alternatively, the hearer may not correctly recognize the speaker's intention, and this may look something like the speaker saying, "Please pass the salts," and the hearer may understand this as the speaker literally wants me to pass them the salts and throw it to them or something. And if this were the case, then uptake would obviously not properly be received because, of course, the hearer did not correctly recognize the speaker's intention. Okay, so now that we've defined these key terms that we're going to need, then we can move on to the introduction of my paper. So my goal for this paper is to form a bridge between two arguments. And the first argument is the idea of discursive injustice, which was introduced by Kukla, writing as Rebecca Kukla, in their paper, Performative Force Convention and Discursive Injustice. And they claim that, quote, "When members of any disadvantaged group faces systemic inability to produce certain kinds of speech acts that they ought, but for their social identity to be able to produce, and in particular, when their attempts result in their actual producing of a different speech act that further weakens or problematizes their social position, then we can say that they suffer a discursive injustice." So with that, the second argument that I'll be using is introduced in Christy Dotson's paper, Tracking Epistemic Violence, Tracking Practices of Silencing. And Dotson uses her idea of testimonial oppression, where she defines, which she defines as the truncating of one's testimony in order to ensure that the testimony contains only content for which one's audience demonstrates testimonial competency. And then she then defines two different categories of testimonial oppression, including testimonial quieting and testimonial smothering. And I will be explaining these two types in a little bit more detail a little later on. So before I get into my argument, I would like to present an example, which you can find in my paper. So Joseph is a transgender man who is currently receiving gender reaffirming healthcare. And he has recently struggled to feel comfortable in everyday social situations because, particularly because he believes that people will identify him as a woman and he will be discriminated against as a result of identifying as a man. And although he often finds himself uncomfortable in everyday social situations, Joseph has been making more of an attempt to increase his level of social interaction. However, he still often does not feel comfortable revealing his identity around others. So one night, Joseph is participating in a study group with some classmates who he has not come out to as trans yet. Recently, one of these classmates posted a derogatory comment about transgender people on social media. Another one of the classmates is a known supporter of an on-campus group which seeks to ban transgender students from participating in athletic activities. And because of this, Joseph feels uncomfortable revealing his gender identity to this group of people. And when the group gets together to meet, Joseph attempts to present himself in a way that would lead these classmates to believe that he is a woman. He wears what many may consider to be traditionally feminine clothing. He wears makeup and even introduces himself using his dead name, which he obviously doesn't prefer to use. And all of this makes Joseph feel extremely uncomfortable, but he does it anyways because he knows that if he were to be identified as transgender, then many of his utterances would be interpreted unlike he intends them to, even though he has the proper credentials to make certain speech acts and is in the proper context and position to utter them. So for example, there may be a point at which one of the members of the study group asks the other members of the group if they understand a certain concept. And Joseph feels like he does understand the concept and he would like to share what he knows. But however, Joseph knows that if he were to reveal his voice and if he were to reveal his identity as being transgender, then his words would receive a literally different uptake than if he were presenting himself as the gender which he was assigned at birth. And perhaps if he were known to be transgender, then the participants in the study group would consider taking Joseph seriously, but they would seek further clarification and proof that what he's saying is correct. And however, if he were to conceal his identity, then his utterance would be taken to be true without having to go through the extra steps in order to prove it. So with this example in mind, I'd like to get into the bones of my argument a little bit. And then we can, after we do that, then we can identify what exactly is going wrong in Joseph's situation. So first, I'm claiming that many people, if not all people, face linguistic disadvantages. And with that in mind, I can move on to my main claim, which is that while it is common for disadvantaged groups to face discursive injustice as a result of their participation in a conversation, certain people may face discursive injustice without even making a speech act at all. And I call this type of discursive justice non-communicative discursive injustice. And I explore this argument specifically through the experience of LGBTQIA+ individuals. And before I move on, I would like to clarify that this concept which I'm introducing can potentially apply to any disadvantaged person or social group, including those of minority, ethnicity, those of a lower social class or status, those whose gender is marginalized in their society, just to name a few. And there are many others, but however, I recognize that LGBTQ+ individuals often have the capability, however undesired, to conceal our identities. And for this reason, I feel that it's particularly helpful and important to view this issue through this sort of lens. So with that, I'd like to go a little bit more into what I mean by non-communicative discursive injustice. So I define a non-communicative discursive injustice as when any person faces a discursive injustice in a scenario where they did not actually make a speech act in order to be the recipient of such an injustice. And such injustices, I might note, take place in a variety of contexts and situations. For example, in Joseph's scenario, he is a victim of non-communicative discursive injustice. And in that example, Joseph would like to contribute to the study group by giving insight into a topic which the rest of the group is having trouble understanding. However, he knows that if he were to make an attempt to speak, he is at risk of revealing his identity. And furthermore, he knows that if he does indeed reveal his identity, then at least some members of the group would not be able to have proper uptake of his speech act. And they would not correctly recognize the intentions of his speech act. So Joseph may intend for the other members of the study group to understand that the information he's telling them is indeed accurate or significant or important. However, after revealing himself as trans, Joseph knows that his speech act would not be properly received. And members of the group will surely assume that because Joseph is transgender, he is somehow less capable of providing accurate, significant, and important information. And if Joseph were in the exact same situation and he was cisgender, he would have no issue receiving proper uptake. However, because he is trans, he knows that he can't. So now I want to describe how my arguments fit within Kuklas definition of discursive injustice. So I'd like to repeat this definition and break it down into some important parts. So again, when members of any disadvantaged group face a systemic ability to be able to produce certain kinds of speech acts that they ought, but for their social identity to be able to produce. And this is the part that I'd like to highlight, the part that's in bold. In particular, when their attempts result in their actual producing of a different speech act that further weakens or problematizes their social position, then we can say they suffer from a discursive injustice. So you may notice that the first part of the definition, the part that's not in bold, is pretty clearly in line with my arguments. However, it is the bolded section which starts to cause some issues because Kuklas states that discursive injustice takes place in particular when their attempts results in the actual production of a different kind of speech act. And at first glance, this line seems to be in direct contradiction with my arguments, because of course I'm claiming that one does not need to attempt any speech act in order to become a victim of discursive injustice. And it seems pretty clearly here that Kukla is saying that when someone's literal attempt at a speech act would cause the producing of a literally different kind of speech act. So that's kind of the issue that I face, but I feel like I can address that. And so the way that I address that is by pointing out that Kukla doesn't actually strictly limit discursive injustices to cases in which certain attempts at speech results in the production of a different speech act. The key phrase in the definition is "in particular." It may be the case, and I'm not denying that it is, that most discursive injustices take place, or many discursive injustices take place when a speaker's attempts at a speech act results in the producing of a different kind of speech act. But however, Kukla does not say that this is the case with all discursive injustices. And so I'd like to clarify my claim by mentioning that non-communicative discursive injustices do not result in the performance of a different speech act, but rather in the lack of any performance of any speech act at all. So now that we've kind of cleared that up, I would like to go back to the topic of testimonial oppression and discuss that a little bit and how it relates to my arguments. So first, as I previously mentioned, Dotson categorizes testimonial oppressions into two main groups. The first is testimonial quieting, which she says takes place when the audience fails to recognize the speaker as a knower. So we kind of see that in the case of Joseph a little bit, where the audience may assume that because Joseph is transgender, that automatically means that because of his literal identity, he somehow has less knowledge or less to offer to the conversation than he would if he were cisgender. So that is the testimonial quieting, excuse me. The second type of testimonial oppression is testimonial smothering, which Dotson says takes place when the speaker perceives one's immediate audience as unwilling or unable to gain the appropriate uptake of a proffered testimony. And I'd like to point out that testimonial smothering is the idea which I'm particularly concerned with for the sake of my argument. And so that will be important to keep that in mind as I go through the rest of my argument. So I'd like to note that the concept of testimonial smothering has been shown to take place quite commonly among LGBTQ plus identifying individuals. A study performed by doctors Jillian Shear, Patricia Harney, Jessica Esposito, and Julia Wolf showed that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals often face high levels of shame in their identities, which frequently lead to mental and physical health issues along with potentially traumatic events. And as a result of this shame, we often feel a need to smother our own testimonies in an attempt to reduce the amount of pain or negative experiences that we may have to feel if we were to reveal our identities. So with that, I'd like to kind of go back to the example of Joseph, and I would like to highlight the fact that these two arguments of discursive injustice and testimonial smothering kind of work hand in hand. And it's an important connection to make, not just as a way of supporting my argument, but also as a way to bring light to this issue of linguistic injustice and to be able to kind of create a space for further discussion in the future. And so in the example, Joseph feels that he must completely truncate his testimony to the point of complete self-censorship in order to reveal his identity. He does this because, as is identified by Dotson's argument, he perceives his audience as being unable to receive the appropriate uptake of what would be his testimony. And because of his knowledge that any utterance would not receive the desired uptake, he prefers to remain silent. In fact, he feels like he has to remain silent. So clearly, this example fits within the bounds of Dotson's ideas, and we can classify this as a case of testimonial smothering. So next, it's important to note that the uptake of Joseph's potential speech act is dependent on whether or not he reveals himself as transgender. So in this case, Joseph knows that by contributing to the conversation, he will reveal his identity, supposedly in the scenario. And he knows that, since we're saying that, at least in this case, he knows that the speech act will not receive the required uptake. And so because of the scenario where he knows that his speech act won't receive the required uptake, we can say that he's a victim of discursive injustice as well. And so remember that making no speech act at all is indeed different from making a speech act with the proper uptake, which in this case, a cisgender person would supposedly be able to do without an issue. So as we can see, Joseph is a victim of testimonial smothering and subsequently a victim of discursive injustices, all without saying a word or making an actual utterance. So I'd also like to mention that, and it's important to mention this, that not all cases of testimonial smothering are cases of non-communicative discursive injustice, and same with not all cases of non-communicative discursive injustice are cases of testimonial smothering. I just believe that the connection between these two arguments is a significant one to make, and this is an important way to kind of view my argument. So with that being said, I'd like to kind of give a recap of what I've covered. So I've established that people, and particularly LGBTQ plus identifying people, face a type of discursive injustice in which nothing actually has to be said, which I call non-communicative discursive injustice. I then established that my claim fits within Kuklas' definition of discursive injustice. And finally, I established that victims of testimonial smothering are often subsequently victims of non-communicative discursive injustice. And I kind of talked about how those arguments fit together and how they contribute to my argument. And so before I wrap up, I'd actually like to talk about where there's some room for expansion on this topic. First, I believe that it would be useful to create some sort of a taxonomy of discursive injustices, prescribing different types of discursive injustice, including non-communicative discursive injustice, into different categories in order to make it more helpful to identify them. And so I'd be interested to see if there would be work to try to kind of categorize this type of linguistic injustice that we experience. Secondly, in future works, I think that it would be significant to identify what exactly it is that LGBTQ plus identifying individuals censor ourselves, or why we censor ourselves, and why do we smother our testimonies. I think that would be an important distinction to make in future papers when talking about this issue. And lastly, I think that it's important to ask the question, how is self-censorship directly caused by potential hearers, and how does it translate into discursive injustice? I think that that would be an interesting point to note as well. And of course, these are just a few examples, and I would love to see more work done in this field. And obviously, I hope to do some more myself. So yeah, anyways, here are my resources. If you're interested in this topic, I'd really suggest reading those two papers, which I talked about in here. They're very interesting, and I think that it's important to discuss this topic, not just for the purpose of contributing to academia, which is really great, but also for the purpose of taking these ideas that we build in philosophy and applying them to our lives to try to use these ideas to make a difference. And so, yeah, with that, that's my presentation. Thank you everyone for being here, and I'll now open to questions.
Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting, I think. Now we can jump to the Q&A section. I think Erim has a question, so I'll let you. Okay.
Thank you for your talking. I have one question, and when I see your example, if Joseph can say I am a transgender man, and there is still a hard problem, because Joseph means if identify yourself as trans man, Joseph means that just I am a trans man, but their audience who are transphobic understand that bad things with words trans man. And my question is that I feel a little bit. My question is that if we don't change trans man, if don't we change the word's meaning trans man, we can solve this problem. I think there's a problem, but if Joseph speak, if Joseph could speak, we can't. He still has a problem. That's
so sorry, just to clarify, you're trying to ask about how there's an issue that if Joseph feels that he can't speak, then there's an issue beyond the type of injustice that I was describing. Sorry, it was just I was having a little bit of a hard time understanding you at the end. I couldn't hear you very well.
I mean, there's a injustice in Joseph example, but if Joseph could speak and identify yourself trans man, his audience who are transphobic understand that not basically he is a trans man. Also, there is normative things, and because if they are transphobic, they means they understand like bad things. And but there is also another problem, because Joseph says that Joseph wants to say that I am just basically trans man. I do identify myself as a trans man. And my question is that we can we solve this problem unless changing the word of trans man? Can I?
Yeah, sorry, it was just yeah, I'm just having a little bit hard time understanding you, but I'll try to explain the example a little bit more. So in this case, kind of has how I mentioned at the beginning of the example, in this scenario, he's going through gender reaffirming surgery. And so a lot of the time for trans people and doing research for this paper, I'm not trans. And so I had to do a lot of researching and talking to other people in order to be able to understand this issue better so that I could speak on it accurately. And from my understanding, a lot of the time when people are transitioning and they're taking hormones in order to help them with their gender reaffirming healthcare, then it often has impacts on their voice, and it can make it seem more obvious to other people, audibly obvious to other people that they are transgender because their voice may not match their appearance according to the traditional senses of gender. And so that's why I feel like Joseph would be needing to basically censor his speech unless it's minimal speaking, because he fears that by speaking too much, then his voice will reveal his identity for him without him actually saying anything. So that's kind of where how I see that issue. I don't know if that answered your question correctly, but I hope that I was able to explain that example a little bit better.
Erin, maybe you can also read the question or more comments to the chat part. Maybe we can jump to the other question. Eylül Zeynep, I think, have a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the speech. It was really good, I think. And I'm also interested in epistemic injustice, so it was very liberating for me. And I would like to ask whether there's a distinction between expressing a self-identity and expressing a thought. So in your example, it seems that when Joseph hides his identity, there is a thing that he doesn't want to express his identity. But after he reveals himself as a trans man or man, and then he, what he afraid is whether his thoughts, his ideas are not going to be taken seriously. So I think these two cases seems to be different from one another. In one sense, he is afraid of explaining his identity. He's afraid of the consequences of that. In the second one, he is afraid of what he says is not going to be taken seriously. So do you think there's a difference between, like, one of them, the second one seems to be more appropriate for your definition of discursive injustice, but the first one seems to be a little bit different when the identity, gender identity is hidden. What do you think? Do you think they are different?
Yeah, I think that it seems so. I guess that my goal with this example, and I understand that's an imperfect example and I'm working on strengthening it, so I'm grateful for your comments about that. But kind of the way, just so you know, that I was thinking through it was that Joseph feels that he has to silence his identity, which goes along with the arguments of testimonial smothering, because he fears that if he were to speak, that by literally speaking, that would reveal his identity. And so that's I think that in this particular example, it gets a little bit confusing because it's kind of mixing up the actual tone of his voice, revealing his identity, and the actual speech that he's making. And so I think that what I was trying to convey is that he fears that if the literal tone of his voice when he made a speech act would reveal his identity. And the important part of the argument is that he knows that if his identity, or he knows supposedly that his identity will be revealed. And then he also knows that because his identity will be revealed, then his speech act will not receive proper uptake. That's kind of how I thought through it. Does that answer your question, or am I kind of missing the point with what you're asking?
Yeah, I got your point. I was just trying to say that in the first case, when he is not speaking, he is not afraid of but he is not afraid of the content of his thoughts, but rather he's afraid of the revealing his identity. So
okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, that's an interesting idea to make, and I think that would be an interesting thing to incorporate into this paper if I were to change it. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I'm honestly, still working through the subject, and so I love to hear other people's perspectives on it. And I'll keep that in mind with the example. I'll have to do a little bit more thinking about it to know how exactly I would structure that argument. But yeah, thank you for the comments and the question.
Okay, thank you for the speech.
Ecem, you have a question?
Yes, I have.
Okay, you can go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your beautiful speech. I would like to ask about how the pre-existing public image of an individual could affect the discursive injustice. For instance, suppose that a person who is known as for instance, a singer or a very known researcher, will be the discursive injustice be as intense as a non very well-known person Or actually, I would like to ask this question because I wonder that meeting with the people who have the similar ideas, and I'm sorry, I couldn't ask, but people who have the similar discursive injustice and having a support from their activities and their representation in public, will this aspect help to come over the discursive injustice? What is your ideas about how could we, well, get over the discursive injustice and treat everyone equally in society? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking. But yeah, to your first point, I think that it would be possible for people who are a little bit more well-known to have a little bit of an easier time overcoming this issue of discursive injustice, simply because, for instance, for a well-known researcher, their work may already be well-known, so they don't have to go through these extra hoops that these other people have to jump through in order to prove that they have the same value conversationally as a cisgender person would. And if you read Kukla's paper, they call those entreaties to speak, where you have to do extra things in order to have in order to receive proper uptake. But yeah, as far as overcoming these issues, I think education. I think that there's been a lot of, in recent years, trying to intentionally silence the voices of marginalized people, particularly in the United States right now. There is a wave of anti-trans bills going through state legislatures all across our country, including the state that I live in. And I think that things like this are incredibly harmful to overcoming this issue, because it's closing doors to potential conversation and discussion. And I love the idea, it's hard to hate people up close. And I think it's kind of like a cliche sentiment, but I think that it works for this, because I think that when you put people in close proximity with each other and you force people to get to know each other's personalities rather than just knowing the labels that have been assigned to them from a distance, it becomes much easier to overcome those labels which you may want to associate with those people. And so I've noticed, even in my own experiences as a gay man in the United States living in a pretty rural conservative area, that there are a lot of people who come off as like really homophobic or really anti-gay. And when you have a conversation with these people and they get to know you, it reduces the hate almost automatically and immediately. So I just think that increasing discourse and conversation in these topics is a really important way to overcome discursive injustice. However, I think that these people who are not the victims, the people who are in the majority, need to step up and take more of a responsibility. So people like in my example of Joseph, where he feels like he is putting himself at risk and he is unsafe revealing his identity, rather it should be the people on the other side stepping forward to help other people be included. Because, for instance, in that example, Joseph felt he felt a lot of pressure to get involved in social situations. And that shouldn't be a pressure that we're putting on people because of their identity. We should instead be inviting people into these social situations and to participate in this discourse and, you know, be equal to everyone else. So yeah, thank you for the question. That was kind of my goal with this paper, is to create that kind of dialogue. How can we overcome this issue? So yeah, thanks for the question, and I hope that answers your question well.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thank you for asking.
Tufan, do you want to ask last question, or normally we are end of the time, but maybe because...
Yeah, we are out of time. So I can just mention this, just, you know, something to think about. Regardless of the person's identity, can there be discursive injustice such that sometimes I try to talk to people, you know, about their beliefs that I don't agree with, like political beliefs or something like that, and they just deny having a constructive conversation, rational conversation, not because who I am or not because of my perceived identity or anything. They just don't want to engage in any kind of, you know, constructive, rational discussion. then I feel like I am being actually, treated unfairly. So it's just an injustice in the sense that I am being silenced, not really being silenced, and not because of my, or smothered, right? Not because of my identity, but because I am denied, this kind of rational constructive dialogue with people. So it's not because of my identity, maybe, but because of their identity. They see themselves as in a certain group, and then they don't want to question that, and they don't want it to be questioned. So anyway, so do you think then this kind of a approach, this kind of a behavior would be a kind of a discursive injustice without targeting any particular identity or identities?
Yeah, for sure. I honestly hadn't really thought about it that way, but I thought that it was particularly convenient and important to discuss my argument through the lens of identity. But yeah, I mean, that's an issue. I understand. I also studied, in addition to philosophy, I studied political science as well. So I've been there with you. But yeah, I think that any time where there's that level of disconnect where they think that because of a difference that this person has with you, that they therefore cannot accept that you have the capability of contributing to the conversation in the same way that they have, then there's a big potential for discursive injustice there. Because, for instance, if you have a political disagreement with someone and they are just completely closed-minded and have no interest in hearing what you have to say, then they automatically think that they are smarter than you and have more information than you without having any actual evidence that that's the case. So, I definitely think that would qualify under this same category. And I think that's important to bring up because that's a pretty common everyday scenario as well that applies to a much broader range of people. So thanks for bringing that up, and thank you for asking the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, for this presentation. It's really interesting, and then there's a really good discussion.